possible. It's not always possible, but we do the best we can. So our oversight and investigation process, did I go through more than one here? Let's see here. Nope, that's good. So at the end of our oversight and investigation is that we may agree with all or only some of the findings made by the institution. And we may make additional findings. The regulation, again, requires that all leads should be pursued, and sometimes institutions, for reasons of self-protection, I mean, it's no secret that institutions in the United States are just as anxious not to have cases of misconduct as anywhere else, so that they don't want to make a case more serious than it really is. But there are often institutional committees will identify additional problems when they're reviewing data, and that is what they are supposed to do. And some institutions won't allow that, and we have to say you should. Sometimes we make them do it over again to do that, or we can make our own independent findings. And one of the cases I'll talk about is the Pullman case, in which we made a lot more findings, not because the institution wouldn't have done it, but because we had access to more grant proposals and could make more findings. And then we then decide whether we may decide that there's insufficient evidence for ORI to make a finding of misconduct. That is sometimes troubling for us, but if the evidence isn't there, often, at least for a long time, it's no longer as frequent, but for years, virtually every case where there was misconduct happening, there had been a hard disk crash. Unfortunately, a hard disk crashed, and none of the data was available anymore. This is respondent after respondent would claim this. Sometimes true, and if the data is not there, it's hard to prove that the experiment wasn't done if the data was lost. So missing data is a problem that may mean that the case cannot reach the legal requirement for finding misconduct. That said, we do the best we can, and we often find additional ways to make findings of misconduct. The final outcomes for our cases is that ORI recommends its findings and proposed administrative actions to the Assistant Secretary for Health, and but over 80% of our cases are settled voluntarily. Since the regulation in 2005 went into place, we've won every case that went to appeal. And those appeals can be very time-consuming and very expensive for the respondent. And if they feel that there's absolutely no chance that they're going to win, there's no point in fighting forever, and so they will eventually agree to a voluntary settlement with that. I actually, in about 2008, our attorneys, for whatever reason, decided that they should not take part in the voluntary settlement agreements and assigned ORI or asked ORI to do it instead. For years and years they'd done it and they wouldn't let us do it, but now all of a sudden we have to do it. So who knows? That's what attorneys do. They always have reasons for things that seem to be different from one day to the next, but whatever. So from about 2008, I basically settled all the cases in ORI for years. And as we got more accomplished at it, more and more of the DIO investigators could also start settling cases. So about 80% of the cases settle, and they can settle it with various kinds of administrative actions. They can range from debarment to basically an administrative action where if the respondent applies for or is supported by public health service funds like NIH grants, their research has to be supervised. In any grant application or paper or abstract that they write has to be reviewed by senior scientists at that institution, make sure that it's accurate, that everything is accurate. So the outcome of institutional Institute and ORI investigations is that it's critical to assign responsibility for each act of misconduct. Those for which there's insufficient or no evidence of knowledge of or participation in the act of misconduct, we cannot make findings against those individuals, and that's really, I think, the co-author issue that may have been raised earlier. There are situations in which institutions may decide to take some administrative actions in a laboratory where the supervision was lax and inadequate. They may decide to supervise the supervisor for a while to make sure that the record keeping is improved, or that the policies and procedures in a laboratory are more carefully adhered to, that record keeping by students that meet certain standards, and that the research is monitored more carefully by the PI. These are all things that can happen in the laboratory. There are also laboratories, and we've seen a number of these cases in recent years in the United States, where a large lab has been accused of massive amounts of misconduct, in which the lab chief has many of his, if not all, of his younger scientists from, let's say, India, just as an example. And everyone is therefore under what we call visa pressure. If the PI becomes unhappy with his or her performance, there's a threat to send them back to their home country. So as a result, there's a culture that occurs for very high productivity and lacks care about the quality of the research in terms of how accurately it was reported. In other words, it's promoting an atmosphere where misconduct is likely to occur. That is a problem that could rise to a level of misconduct if it could be shown that the PI knew that his her junior scientists were falsifying data. It happened at the University of Connecticut Health Center several years ago, and it's happened elsewhere as well. There's one of I remember distinctly an email that contained a PowerPoint demonstration that had credible images showing apparent falsification in 56 papers by one laboratory. That case is still ongoing, so I can't identify anything more, but it's an example of what I'm talking about. And so the institution and ORI can recommend papers that ought to be retracted or corrected. The issue is that is a decision made by the editor of the journal, so it's inappropriate for ORI or the institution to demand that be done, but they could certainly request it. And I think that's one of the premier reasons why ORI exists, is to do its best to make sure the scientific literature is as clean as possible, so that your efforts at reproducing data and going and moving forward with your science is not held back by relying on poor data or unreliable data. I mean, the problem's bad enough anyway. To make it's worse by the fact that there's false data to worry about. And another administrative action that ORI imposes on all of its findings or all of its respondents is being forbidden to participate in any advisory capacity to a public health service, which is primarily NIH. You can't participate in peer review, ad hoc committee reviews, anything of that sort. That would include the FDA as well. Now, on very, very rare occasions, HHS, but not ORI, may seek to recover funds. As some of you may know, there is Senator Grassley from the state of Iowa, who is very interested in saving the government money, and he's pushed NIH pretty hard about recovery of funds on a couple of cases. But it's very rare that NIH attempts to do that. ORI, I don't think I've made this point strongly enough yet. ORI's purpose is forward-looking. So when we make recommendations for findings of misconduct, it's not designed by the nature of our regulation to be punitive. It's not designed to put somebody in jail. It's not designed to fine them. It's designed to prevent them from causing further harm in the future. I mean, that's really important. And so what our administrative actions entail is preventing them from misspending federal funds. We publicize their name so that they can't quietly go to another institution and pick up where they left off in terms of their bad behavior. I think that's really the gist of what makes ORI as important as it is. But the consequence of an ORI finding is that it's immortal. Every respondent that we have identified since 1992 can be found on Google, even though the administrative actions have long since stopped being in effect. And that's a bit unfortunate, but it's, at least for the few years in which their administrative actions are in effect, it's really critical that people can look up their name and find that they may have been the same person who was found, that ORI found to commit misconduct. Well, that's a good thing to know when you want to hire somebody. So that's the sum of a very quick overview of administrative procedures. I'm going to talk about 4, or if there's time, 5 cases in which ORI played a significant part in helping make the findings. The first one is Homer Venters, a PhD, MD student at the University of Illinois. Amitov Hajra of the University of Michigan and at NIH. And then William Simmons at the University of Texas in Dallas, a graduate student. And then Mona Therashavam, a PhD at the New Jersey Medical and Dental University, as an assistant professor. Lastly was Eric Pullman of the University of Vermont, a full professor and very well noted researcher in gerontology. He is the one of the few scientists who's actually gone to jail. And I'll get to that case last if I have time. So Dr. Venters was a dual investigator at the university, MD PhD program at the University of Illinois. He was accused of falsification in a PhD research in 2002. The original investigation cleared him of charges. It was a little complicated because he was very highly thought of in the MD program in the medical school, and in his PhD program, the medical school gave his professor a lot of pressure to minimize or make the case go away. And for whatever reason, we don't know the details at that time, they failed to make a finding of misconduct. And it was only when ORI got the report and one of my investigators started looking into what appeared to have happened that we went back to the university, had some discussions with them, and they agreed to reopen the investigation. And this time they made findings of misconduct and took away his PhD. He retained his MD degree, and he's still practicing medicine. So here's the basis for what he did wrong. For whatever reason, he was doing his research. He created this file, this single file, in either PowerPoint or Photoshop, I don't remember which, but this has about 208 individual images in it. They're all piled on top of each other like a trash heap. But you can take, on the computer, you can click on any one of these images and pull it out and he used it to make his figures. He just made up fabricated figures out of these pieces of gel data that he generated. They cut him out, put him